Sometimes the heart becomes careful. After experiencing deep betrayal, you intuitively learn to fiercely protect your most fragile feelings. Not because it stopped caring. Deep inside, you still possess a vast, beautiful capacity to love someone completely. But because pain changed it, the agonizing, heavy memory of shattered trust dramatically altered how you view relationships. Trust became incredibly difficult. You carefully hold back your true words, terrified they might be weaponized against you again. Vulnerability feels entirely dangerous. Stepping out into the open requires a terrifying amount of courage you lack right now. So your weary heart protects itself quietly. You gracefully develop thick, invisible armor to keep further damage far away. From disappointment, you completely lock away your highest hopes, assuming that expecting genuine love will only lead to pain. From rejection, the terrifying fear of not being enough constantly shadows your every attempt at forming a deep connection. From being hurt again, you deliberately maintain a safe, lonely distance to guarantee your delicate spirit remains entirely untouched. You still desperately want connection. That quiet, glowing desire for true intimacy burns steadily beneath your thickest protective defenses. But fear creates massive distance. You helplessly find yourself pushing people away right when they finally start getting close. Even when love feels close, the unknown territory of absolute trust seems too unpredictable, risky, and incredibly terrifying. Because heavy memories of pain remain, past betrayals constantly echo, loudly demanding that you stay fiercely guarded and alert. Your soul deeply remembers heartbreak. It vividly recalls the devastating, breathless shock of having your most profound trust broken. So emotional walls slowly rise. They build up naturally, creating an impenetrable fortress meant to guarantee your absolute safety. Not from hatred, you do not push others away out of malice, but from a deeply desperate need for preservation. But purely from fear, the agonizing terror of repeating history completely overshadows the beautiful promise of a new beginning. And your heart quietly longs to feel safe again, to finally lay down the heavy armor and truly breathe. Fear fundamentally changes how your heart loves. You learn to deeply hide your most tender feelings to survive. Not openly. You no longer offer your entire soul freely, heavily guarding against the sudden shock of betrayal. But carefully, every single emotional step is fiercely calculated to protect your incredibly fragile, deeply bruised inner self. Deep pain taught your weary soul absolute caution. You constantly scan every new relationship for terrifying, hidden dangers. So genuine trust feels impossibly risky now. The terrifying leap into the emotional unknown seems entirely too dangerous. Even genuine kindness feels deeply uncertain. Your hyper-vigilant mind constantly suspects a hidden motive behind every gentle gesture. Because your vulnerability vividly remembers the profound pain, your nervous system reacts to closeness as an immediate threat. And your heavily guarded heart absolutely fears repeating it. You instinctively push away the very warmth you need. You still desperately want deep connection. Beneath the thick armor, your lonely spirit aches to be truly seen. But absolute emotional safety feels incredibly fragile. You constantly expect the fragile glass of trust to shatter again. So distance quietly grows. You deliberately maintain a lonely, protected gap to ensure nobody can suddenly hurt you. Not because you stop completely caring. Your capacity to love is vast, but currently imprisoned by heavy anxiety. But because profound hurt entirely changed your trust, you locked your deepest hopes away to survive the fallout. The paralyzing fear stays deeply hidden. You present a completely strong exterior, while secretly terrified of emotional closeness. Quietly, the defensive clench of your weary mind operates entirely in silence, pushing potential love safely far away. Deeply, it subtly suffocates your daily interactions, leaving you feeling entirely disconnected even when people are right there. And thick emotional walls become completely familiar. The isolating fortress you built ironically becomes your only safe home. Even while your fractured soul desperately still hopes, a quiet, persistent spark continues yearning for an authentic bond. For genuine love that feels absolutely safe, a relationship where your vulnerable, bruised heart doesn't have to hide. And profound peace beyond the terrifying fear, a beautiful dawn where your exhausted spirit can finally, securely rest. Eventually, the heart becomes distant. You unknowingly build a quiet, invisible fortress to completely protect your peace. Not physically, you might be sitting right next to someone, yet feel thousands of miles away emotionally. But emotionally, you carefully lock away your deepest thoughts, refusing to share what truly matters inside. You completely stop opening fully. Sharing your authentic self feels like handing someone a weapon against you. Even when genuine connection appears, a beautiful, safe opportunity arrives, but you instinctively remain securely closed. Because fear quietly whispers constant warnings, aggressively reminding you of the devastating heartbreak you barely survived. What if the crushing pain returns? What if this new person secretly carries the exact same betrayal? What if your fragile trust breaks again? The terrifying drop into disappointment keeps you completely paralyzed. So the weary soul stays deeply cautious. Every interaction is carefully calculated to guarantee your absolute safety. Protective, you hide your tender hopes and dreams securely away, where absolutely no one can ruin them. Emotionally guarded, you invite people just close enough to prevent loneliness, but never close enough to hurt. Even while desperately longing for closeness, your spirit aches for true intimacy despite the massive, thick walls. Because old wounds still ache quietly, the painful memories vividly remind you of the massive emotional cost. And vulnerability feels entirely unsafe. Removing your heavy armor seems like a dangerous, foolish, and terrifying gamble. You deeply miss emotional closeness. You mourn the beautiful, effortless connection you had before the betrayal happened. But paralyzing fear keeps controlling the distance, expertly convincing you that absolute isolation is your only safety. Still, something inside you desperately longs to trust again. A tiny, resilient spark quietly refuses to fade. To feel completely safe again. To finally let out a deep breath in someone's secure, welcoming presence. To love entirely without fear again. To beautifully share your heart without bracing for a sudden impact. And finally rest emotionally. To lay down the exhausting defense mechanisms and discover genuine, lasting, safe peace. Jesus deeply understands heavily guarded hearts. He recognizes the thick, protective walls you built to survive, even the profound fear hidden safely inside them. He sees the terrified spirit, desperate for connection. He clearly sees the deep wounds hidden beneath your absolute caution, offering endless grace without judgment. The devastating heartbreak. He acknowledges the completely shattered expectations that forced you into isolated silence. The sudden, shocking betrayal. He knows exactly how much it cost you to genuinely love before. And the immense, terrifying fear of trusting again. Letting someone close feels entirely like a risk, because emotional walls were absolutely never a weakness. Your guardedness is a remarkably brilliant defense mechanism. They were pure survival. Your profoundly exhausted mind naturally protected itself from absorbing any further damage. Your delicate heart learned absolute caution after deep pain, carefully holding back to ensure complete safety. And Jesus never once rejected that woundedness. He approaches your heavy armor with incredible, perfect patience. He stays eternally patient with fragile hearts, never violently forcing your heavy, protective doors to open. Gentle, his deeply comforting presence offers an incredibly secure refuge where you can truly rest. Safe, surrounded completely by his boundless love, your anxious nervous system can finally, beautifully stand down. Because healing genuine trust takes profound time, rebuilding shattered faith is a slow, deeply delicate journey. And grace absolutely never forces vulnerability. True love waits completely until you are genuinely ready. It beautifully restores emotional safety slowly, carefully demonstrating that you do not have to hide anymore. Your deep wounds are entirely not shameful. They are golden, resilient testaments to your incredible survival. They simply need profound healing. The heavy aches from your past beautifully deserve gentle, divine attention. The overwhelming, paralyzing fear slowly softens, carefully melting away underneath his completely unconditional, steady devotion. Little by beautifully little, the deep, agonizing terror of rejection gently gives way to genuine hope. The heavily exhausted heart begins trusting warmth again, discovering that true connection can be entirely safe. Because incredibly safe love finally feels genuinely possible, you are no longer entirely trapped by the past. And beautiful, lasting emotional peace slowly returns, washing over your deeply weary soul with profound relief. Even after experiencing absolute deep heartbreak, your beautiful spirit rediscovers how to securely, genuinely feel alive. Healing begins when the heavily guarded heart finally feels truly safe again. Trust is rebuilt through patient, steady security. Not pressured, you cannot instantly force yourself to open up and genuinely love before your delicate wounds have healed. Not forced, the thick protective walls of isolation naturally begin to melt away when you are completely ready. But gently, you carefully step out from behind the heavy armor, realizing that connection does not guarantee betrayal. The exhausting fear slowly loses absolute control over your mind. The terrifying anticipation of rejection gracefully, beautifully fades. Because divine grace restores deeply and patiently. He walks beside your broken trust, gently offering absolute, unconditional safety. Your weary soul breathes much easier. The heavy, stifling isolation is gradually replaced by a comforting, deeply open space. And true vulnerability feels significantly less dangerous. You begin gently sharing the hidden, incredibly tender parts of yourself. Not because the deep pain completely disappeared, But because your fragile fractures are now securely filled with profound light. But because healing beautifully stayed, the comforting warmth proved it was reliable, not just another temporary, painful illusion. Your fiercely guarded heart slowly opens again. The quiet ache of loneliness is delicately met with authentic intimacy. Carefully, you take incredibly brave, small steps toward allowing another person into your deeply private, highly sensitive inner world. Safely, you miraculously discover that genuine love provides a secure foundation rather than an unstable, totally terrifying trap. Because true emotional healing fundamentally changes your deeply rooted fear. It replaces absolute terror with a quiet, brilliant courage. He especially tends to profoundly wounded hearts. His endless patience creates the ultimate sanctuary for your exhausted spirit. The thick, isolating loneliness finally softens. You comfortably step entirely into the brilliant, life-giving light you previously avoided. The massive, invisible walls slowly and gracefully fall down. You allow your genuine self to beautifully, authentically blossom. And genuine trust suddenly feels entirely possible again. You realize that reaching out does not automatically mean getting hurt, because your deeply exhausted soul never stopped desperately needing to genuinely love and be truly safely loved. It simply needed absolute safety to successfully heal. Surrounded by His grace, your fragile trust is beautifully reborn. Peace feels unfamiliar at first. When your nervous system has spent years surviving on high alert, genuine calm feels strange. Because your heart stayed guarded too long. You lived in heavy survival mode, entirely forgetting how to simply exist openly. But slowly fear softens. The thick, heavy walls of your emotional fortress beautifully melt into clear, welcoming, and safe pathways. Your soul breathes easier. The deep, heavy silence of isolation is replaced by the gentle rhythm of secure, true connection. Not perfectly. You still have moments of hesitation, carefully testing if this newfound warmth is truly secure enough to trust. But safely, the terrifying storms that used to flood your mind have completely settled into a smooth, brilliant, quiet refuge. Because healing stayed, the divine light illuminating your fractured soul is not temporary, but an incredibly secure, deeply permanent sanctuary. And your wounds no longer control everything. The fragile hope you desperately protected through the harsh winter now shines brightly. Grace teaches the heart trust again. Standing perfectly still beside Him, your deeply exhausted spirit rediscovers how to securely rest. Even after profound heartbreak, His radiant warmth beautifully fills the empty spaces, proving you do not have to walk alone. The fear slowly loosens. The tight, heavy grip of emotional distance entirely softens inside His deeply unconditional, beautifully steady love. The emotional distance fades. You no longer have to build massive walls, because His presence is an absolute protective refuge. And your heart feels lighter. The exhausting, invisible weight of anticipating betrayal is beautifully and completely lifted from your shoulders. Because love no longer feels only dangerous. The completely frozen depths of your weariness gracefully yield to a vibrant calm. Your soul finally feels emotionally safe resting. Under His steadfast watch, the terrifying urge to completely pull away totally disappears. And vulnerability no longer feels terrifying. You can beautifully exist in the open, completely surrounded and protected by His warmth. Fear is not your identity. The deeply exhausting, heavy season of intense emotional guarding does not define your true self. Neither is heartbreak. The painful, suffocating void you carry for so long is finally being completely replaced by beautiful warmth. Healing changes the heart slowly. It tenderly awakens the deeply buried parts of your soul you desperately thought were lost. Little by beautifully little, the incredibly heavy, thick walls gracefully dissolve, allowing your genuine feelings to safely flow once again. Trust begins returning naturally. The deep, painful fractures in your exhausted spirit are safely and completely filled with radiant light. Because grace stayed beside you, his incredibly patient, unwavering love remained your secure anchor when you felt absolutely terrified inside. Even during profound emotional fear, when you had no remaining strength to reach out, he constantly held your fragile heart. Even during completely guarded silence, he never once abandoned your deeply weary soul to face the terrifying, freezing storm alone. The heavy fear no longer controls absolutely everything. A beautiful, radiant, divine warmth effortlessly fills your entire inner space now. And your soul feels genuinely alive again. The crushing, invisible weight of anticipating betrayal is beautifully lifted from your shoulders. Because true healing restores deeply. It touches the most exhausted, frantic parts of your mind with absolute secure reassurance. Especially heavily wounded hearts, he tenderly revitalizes the weary spirit that has spent years running desperately on endless survival mode. You slowly stop living inside emotional fear. Breathing in the fresh morning air, you courageously embrace actual, profound emotional freedom, and finally begin genuinely trusting warmth again. You realize that stepping fully into his calm is perfectly and always safe. Maybe your heart was never difficult to love. Perhaps you were just deeply, understandably terrified inside. Maybe it was simply afraid. Your weary spirit entirely drained itself trying to fiercely protect you. Afraid of carrying pain again, the heavy, invisible burden of constant betrayal completely overwhelmed your resilience. After trusting too deeply before, the crushing weight of having your most profound trust broken paralyzed you. Even while longing for closeness, your brave, desperate attempt to survive the heartbreak inevitably led to isolation. And Jesus stayed near your guarded heart. He perfectly understood the profound, heavy quietness protecting your soul. Even during the fear, when you felt entirely separated from your own passions, his warmth never left. Even during emotional distance, he tenderly guarded the tiny, fragile hope you thought was completely extinguished. Because genuine healing happens patiently. Grace does not violently demand that you instantly recover from long winters. Quietly, the overwhelming, suffocating freeze gradually subsides, beautifully replaced by an incredibly deep, enduring and radiant stillness. Tenderly, he waits with you absolutely faithfully, allowing your exhausted spirit to completely relearn genuine, safe trust. Until the soul finally feels safe loving again, enveloped entirely in his boundless, securely warm love. Your fear is not permanent. The heavy protective armor you wore for so long will beautifully, safely fall away. Neither are the thick walls around your heart. True, unconditional love will naturally dissolve the barriers you built to survive. Healing slowly changes deep emotional fear. The agonizing anticipation of betrayal is replaced by genuine, secure, and steady comfort. And grace slowly restores your trust again. Standing completely safe in his presence, you realize intimacy doesn't guarantee pain. Because absolute safe love is still entirely possible. Your deeply exhausted soul is finally allowed to genuinely open up, and your weary heart finally learns true peace again. Surrounded entirely by his love, you are free to simply exist.